So I would like to introduce Brian Sturdivant. He's a landscape ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station, working in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. Dr. Sturdivant's research program includes broad-scale investigations of forest dynamics, fire and insect disturbance ecology, and wildlife ecology. His strengths include spatial analyses, landscape-scale field research, and forest landscape disturbance and succession modeling. His approach to research is generally interdisciplinary and multi-scaled, focusing on applied questions related to fire risk, forest health, and forest sustainability. Dr. Sturdivant is part of a larger team that includes scientists from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, Iowa State University, and others from the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station. Today, I've asked him to come and speak about a study that they did. It's called Fire Severity and Ecosystem Impacts Following the Pagami Creek Fire, a rapid response they did shortly after the fire occurred. So, Brian, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Robert, for that introduction, and thanks for the invitation. This is a fantastic group to present to. I do want to acknowledge my other co-authors and project investigators on the group, Phil Townsend, myself, Randy Kolka, Sean Fravor, Eric Gustafson, Jay Charney, Peter Walter, and Lee Freelick. It's certainly a team effort, and I want to emphasize that as we move our way through the presentation. Also acknowledging our funding resources, in particular the National Science Foundation's Rapid Response Program, as well as NASA and the U.S. Forest Service. In particular, this work could not have been done without the cooperation of the Superior National Forest, which was outstanding. So with that, I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide here. Just by way of introduction, the Pagami Creek Fire is the largest observed in Minnesota since 1894. It started as a lightning strike in mid-August of 2011. You can take a look at this map to see the progression of the fire over time. In particular, you can see right about September 9th and 10th was the transition between a kind of a surface fire, which is up in this northwestern corner here, into a wind-driven crown fire that proceeded towards the southeast, and then on the 12th it changed in direction and moved rapidly towards the east. In particular, on that particular day, in the afternoon, it consumed about 75,000 acres in 5 hours. So it's a very rapid moving fire. A lot of attention to this, a lot of smoke that came out of it, and it's what caught my attention. I woke up in the morning in Rhinelander, which is located about here, to smoke in the morning, and took a look at the news and found there was a fire burning in the Boundary Waters. We knew that, again, we had wind gusts in the afternoon on the morning, or the afternoon of the 12th. Were on the order of 15 to 20 miles an hour, with gusts as high as 35 miles an hour. So it was a very rapidly spreading fire, created a lot of smoke, and that smoke was noticed not only in Minnesota, but also regionally as well. You can see the smoke as it was making its way down through where I live, in Rhinelander, down all the way, in particular in Chicago. They had a lot of issues with smoke. And if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see that smoke traveled all the way across Europe as well. You can see the trail of smoke from the Pagami fire making its impact there as well. And so it's a lot of publicity from the fire. It was again, it was a naturally caused fire. It was under attention in the beginning of a fire. The hope was that it might spread to, say, on the order of, say, a 3,000 acre fire, but conditions really changed dramatically in that mid-September time period that changed the behavior of the fire very dramatically. The reason why we had such a strong interest in this particular fire was when I took a look at where that fire occurred. You can see this circle that's over here, or this yellow rectangle on the right-hand side, is the approximate location of the fire. And this is where we had been doing some intensive remote sensing work, particularly with my colleagues Peter Walter and Phil Townsend, looking at everything from land cover to forest structural characteristics to insect disturbance. And so this is a real hotspot for remote sensing, which provided a lot of background or pre-fire information for the Pagami fire. To give you an example of some of the pre-fire information that we have a time series of land cover that spans all the way back to the early 1970s. This is from 2000. And I guess what I'm going to show here is just a few things. If you can see the arrow in the center, that is the Powwow Trail, which is an old logging road. So even though this is within a wilderness area, the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, there was some logging history. There's a logging camp that's located right here at the fringe of the border at the early 1970s. So there was some logging that occurred on the eastern side. Further west, it was primarily old growth conifer forests. And so we do have an idea of the disturbance history of this area. And some very detailed information derived from a combination of Landsat and SPOT and radar analysis performed by Peter Walter as part of his dissertation. You can see on the upper left-hand side we have structural characteristics like canopy diameter. On the right, things that are valuable relative to live fuel, such as the vertical length of the live crown. On the lower left, we have an example of basal area, and on the right, we have a reconstructed dominant tree species map. And to be clear, this is not a typical classification of trees here, or tree species, or forest types. What this is a reconstruction based on, for every cell, you have the proportion of the basal area that's comprised of each tree species, and from that, you can derive a forest or dominant tree map. So we have a lot of information, which is what made this kind of a compelling research question here. And so this is an aerial view of the fire as it was towards the end of its burn period, with a few areas of remaining smoke left. And so we went to the National Fire Science Foundation and made a compelling argument for a rapid grant to get into the burn immediately, with the idea that a lot of the indicators of fire severity are ephemeral, and because of that, we needed to get in there right away. And for those of you who are not on the research side, certainly from the land management side or the wildfire protection side, you folks have quick and ready access to those fires. The bark and the bear estimates that are done usually right after the fire, those are fairly immediate. But in terms of research, research just doesn't move that fast. In general, you usually have to wait about a year for funding to kick in. And so the RAPID grant is designed for this kind of rapid response, to get in there quickly to address the kinds of questions that I've outlined here. And so we had 3 questions that we posed to the NSF. The first was to what extent do remotely sensed, in this case hyperspectral imagery, estimates of fire severity reflect field-based severity indices in both the overstory and the understory. The second question is how do overstory and understory fire severities influence soil carbon, nitrogen, and mercury loss immediately after a fire in comparison with those in the first growing season after the fire. And third, to what extent does pre-fire forest condition affect the post-fire nutrient decomposition and regeneration dynamics found across that burn? And so this was, again, some work here by Peter Walter. We have a first cut fire severity map, or burn severity index, produced from Landsat change detection techniques. Most of you may be familiar with the difference normalized burn ratio. In this case, we use the relative difference normalized burn ratio, looking at a pre-fire Landsat image in comparison with a post-fire image that you see down the bottom here, to estimate relative change that indicates fire impacts. And so this is the resulting map that you see from that, classified into 5 different burn severity classes. As you can see in the upper left-hand corner, up in the northwestern part of the study area where the fire started, that shows a low severity pattern that's indicative of a surface fire that was occurring at that time. And then as you can see, you can actually see the burn pattern, the sequence of the burn as it occurred over time. And so you've got different dates as you have a transition in the nighttime periods. That fire slowed down and then picked up again the following day towards the south. You have another nighttime signature here in the burn severity map as that again changed in direction and headed off towards the east, and then where you have very severe burn patterns heading off towards the east on that day, and also towards the southeast in these tongues that were occurring down here. So our intent was to go in and capture a range of fire severities across a range of different representative forest types so that we could use the remote sensing information to scale up the impacts of the burn from the plots to the full extent of that burn. And so this is the distribution of our field plots that you see primarily along the northern corridor here where there is good strong lake access up towards the north, and also in along this brown stripe here is the Powwow Trail that provided some access to the central part of the burn. We also accessed FIA points that had phase 3 information, which included soil and other attributes. The black dots that you see in here are reference plots that we collected to use as an indication of what pre-fire forest conditions would have looked like had we measured them prior to the burn. And we can then use the remote sensing information to extrapolate those to areas that were burned. There were a few additional ones not shown on this map that were located along the northern perimeter, right along here and along here as well. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of walk you through this burn in across some of the different kinds of observations that we had. And this is in late October that we were able to get in there. It was at a time when the fire was about 99 to 100% contained, and within a few weeks following our entry, we had snow on the ground. So we were just barely snuck in time to do our measurements and get out of there. This is an area showing low severity burn, and this is pretty typical. What you see is a lot of trees that are fallen down. This is a system that has very shallow soils, which means a shallow root system. So even a pretty moderate or light severity burn in the understory can burn the root tips and cause these trees to fall over. And so these are actually fairly difficult to move through. And the other thing I'd point out from this is that you can see a lot of the bright, recently killed foliage or scorched foliage. That is a key indicator of tree burn severity. And just keep in mind that this is the same kind of information or that you can see on the ground that the satellite is also going to be picking up. You know, our Avarice flight was occurring about the same time that we're out measuring fire severity on the ground. This is an example of a surface fire that went through a plantation towards the southern fringe of the burn in a road accessible area. And what you're actually looking at is the scorched needles that had come down by the time we had gotten out there. And so that understory was burned through, but it didn't actually burn through the canopy. So all the remaining foliage is then has come down following that burn. This is an example of a dense thicket that's fairly common throughout this area. A lot of balsam fir that you see in the understory with some other conifers. Looks like there's black spruce in this area. And this is a fairly high severity burn. What you're looking down the center is the powwow trail. And so anything that any disturbance or features of the understory were really pronounced once that understory was burned away. This would be an area that if you had walked through it before the burn, you wouldn't have been able to see more than a few feet to either side. This would be an example of a very severely burned plot. This is actually has a pretty high deciduous content. You can see the strip bark that's most likely aspen. And in the understory here, again, you see a lot of the balsam fir that probably contributed to the severity of that burn on this particular site. And just by way of context for the Pagami fire, again, this is occurred in late August into September, and it coincided with not only pretty severe weather conditions, but also a drought that had been accumulating by the end of the season. So very dry conditions by the time this fire burned through. So those are some examples of the uplands. A few examples from the lowlands. This is an example of the fire that burned down from the uplands into the border of the lowland forest, again burning the root tips of the black spruce here that caused it to tip over. So you have a partial burn into the lowland here. This next example would be where the fire just carried straight through the lowland, kind of scorched the top of the sphagnum moss as it made its way through. In other cases, we saw some pretty severe deep burning of the peat. This is actually a tamarack swamp where the peat had burned down about 2 feet. What you're looking at is the exposed root system there. And so a lot of carbon would have gone up into the atmosphere from a place like this. There's a lot of confusion in the literature in terms of what fire severity actually means. This paper from Keeley is actually a good paper to help tease out what we mean when we say fire severity. So we're talking about fire severity. We're talking about the impact of the burn on a particular place. In general, the indicator is the amount of organic matter that's lost. Fire intensity, of course, contributes to that. Fire intensity would be defined as the energy released that would then result in the loss of organic matter or the impacts that you observe. Fire severity or burn severity are generally interchangeable. And then you have the ecosystem response. That's the erosion that follows or the vegetation recovery that follows that initial impact, as well as the societal impacts as well, which indicates loss of life, property, or the suppression costs associated with that burn. And where things tend to get fuzzy is when people begin to mix definitions between, say, fire intensity and fire or burn severity, or ecosystem response and burn severity. What we're focused on here is the impact itself, what happened. And one of the most important things that I've highlighted down here is that it's not there's a clear separation between what happens to the vegetation versus what happens to the soil. Those are two generally correlated things, but they're not always correlated, so it's important to measure both. So this is our initial plot layout that we use to measure fire severity and also measure soil impacts. And so this outer ring that you see here defines the outer extent of the plot that we use to assess burn severity to the trees. And it's a 12.6 meter radius plot. And then we had subplots within that plot. These smaller plots here were where we assess forest floor impacts. And then these smaller yet plots were where we collected our soils information according to standardized FIA protocol. I list Sean Fravor here as Sean was the one that brought the burn severity experience to the team and helped design this study design that you see here. Another thing that we did, which turned out to be very important, was we took a standardized photo series at every single plot. And so for every, from plot center, we took a panoramic of 6 shots from the center point in the same sequence. And then we took images of the ground surface at both the soil sample locations as well as the understory severity estimate locations. We took an image straight down as well as straight up, so you can see what it looks like on the forest floor as well as what it looks like in the canopy. What you're looking at here is on the left-hand side is an infrared image, and on the right-hand side is a normal color image. And this pulls out differences that satellites will be able to detect within their different wavelengths. And one of the things I'd like to point out here, this is a stand that had burned an aspen stand. And it's important to think about the phenology of the burn as it happened so that you can use that as context to, in your fire severity assessment. So in this case, the burn occurred before leaf senescence. It was primarily mid-September. That's before the leaves were dropped. And so what that means is that the abscission layer hadn't formed yet on the leaves. And so what you're looking at here in the ground is leaves that are still attached to twigs because they hadn't developed that abscission layer and they hadn't senesced yet. And so that tells us that was foliage that was scorched during the burn rather than green foliage that simply fell normally during the autumn senescence. And so that tells us, okay, what kind of foliage are we looking at? Was it consumed? Was it scorched? Or did it naturally senesce during the autumn leaf drop?
So, Brian?
Yes?
We do have a question concerning this particular slide. Charles is asking if you, in this particular case, were you taking the canopy with fish eye lens or special equipment?
No, in this case, we just used a regular camera. Well, I mean, of course, we use an infrared, which is not typical, but it was just a typical lens on the camera, and really, it was just a method of going in there and rapidly assessing what's there. And so a fisheye lens, I think, would have been preferable. I think we would have gotten more information from those sites. But remember, we took, let me see, there would have been 6 shots of the canopy in total for this particular site. So there's quite a bit of information from this photo series.
And I will just take a moment here again. Someone used the interface to raise their hand, apparently. I would encourage folks that if you have questions to type them in with the chat box in the lower left-hand corner, as Charles did. And I will be tracking that throughout the presentation, asking questions where it seems appropriate. So please continue to ask questions as we go along.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Robert. This format is a bit new to me, so if I miss raised hands or even the chat box, I've told Robert to chime in if there's an urgent question. So please feel free to ask questions as we go along. So this is an example of a low severity burn, and this really shows the difference between the infrared on the left-hand side and the normal color on the right-hand side. In particular, infrared is picking out vegetation. Doesn't matter if it's necessarily live or dead. It pulls out vegetation very strongly, and so you can see how the sensor from above may be picking up those different signals from each location. This would have been a low severity burn that occurred within a jack pine stand.
Well, so Brian, I'll ask the question, perhaps some others are thinking it as well. Certainly the image on the left, the false image, gives you that impression, but even if you look at the one on the right, it looks like there's some significant mortality.
Yes.
Can you maybe differentiate the two images a little bit in our minds as to how you're characterizing that severity?
Okay, sure. Well, actually, there will be a chance as I get a little bit further on to show how we actually classify the severity. Is that what you're asking?
Okay.
And so maybe that's where we'll go from there. But really, what you have here is an example of, we're looking at in the if you look at on the right hand side here, up towards the upper right, you'll see what you would typically assess in terms of tree burn severity, where you see scorched foliage versus green foliage, and then on in the middle slide here, that's what we're actually looking at when we're looking at what I call understory burn, or in particular, I'll get to the soil burn index. And then the canopy is just showing you what's above you, just for context.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So this is again, even though we've been measuring burn severity for decades, there hasn't been a very consistent way of measuring. Typically, you go out, folks will go out there and measure impacts for a variety of reasons. It could be it could be for impacts to the particular forest. It could be that they have a particular metric that they're interested in for a scientific study, and there hasn't been a lot of coordination until recently to come up with standardized metrics of burn severity. And Terry Jane, I apologize, I've actually misspelled her first name here, but Terry was instrumental in developing this particular burn severity index. She came out and visited our site this past summer to help the application of this burn severity index. But I guess what I'd like to focus on here is this is a work that she had done in 2007, which had evolved a little bit since then. But the idea is the same, is that you want to be able to link your your severity estimates to some kind of ecological or physical processes that have happened to cause that. And so what we focused on is what's here in gray, which is the post-fire environment. That's what we're actually measuring. But they should have some correlation between that and the process, which would be, say, flame length or scorch, or mortality that occurs due to the process of what's occurring during the burn. So again, what I'd like to emphasize here is that what's here shown in gray is what we're measuring. We're measuring what we see, but the levels should correspond to some process of interest, in particular what happened during the fire and the potential consequence or response of the ecosystem to that. And so this is the tree burn severity index that we use. It's fairly simple. It's very rapid to apply. Of course, you have no evidence of recent fire would be a 0. And then the questions are, you simply flow down as you would use a key. So it's the presence of green trees. If you have them, then you just estimate the proportion of green trees, would put you in your first class 1, and then subclasses within that class 1. You may be just 100% or nearly 100% brown. That would put you in class 2. If you have a mixture of brown and black canopies, burned foliage, then that would put you in class 3. And then depending on whether or not you have more brown than black or the reverse would assign you one of those subcategories within that. And then you can have essentially 100% black would put you in category 4. And this just shows that two things, really, to show that we did, in fact, capture the range of different severities across the study area, and just to demonstrate how you might apply the index. So you can see in the upper left-hand corner, you're really looking at about, you have burn that occurred, but it's a pretty low severity in terms of crown damage. And you can kind of progress along. From the top layer is primarily class 1. At different levels with different levels of greenness. And as you go down to the next level, you get into primarily scorched, going from left to right in this middle line here. You have progressively increasing severity of tree damage. And then as you get to the bottom here, particularly these two slides at the lower right-hand side, you've got primarily black. And as you can see as well, the damage to the understory you'd expect to be correlated to what's happening in the overstory, but they're not always the same, which is really the important point and why we separate those two measures. So that leads us to soil burn severity. And again, the same kind of method, trying to link the different levels, which are shown here in the gray. And again, this has evolved since the time this publication has come out, to what's actually happening in the environment. In this case, temperatures. And so the damage to the ground layer is primarily a function of not only heat, but also residence time of that heat. And so you would expect different indicators of, or loss of litter, loss of the humus layer, and then different coloring to the soil depending on the temperatures that you've reached. And so when you get down to, say, or up to the temperatures around 300 to 400 degrees Celsius, that tends to turn that soil layer to gray. And in fact, if you get to even warmer temperatures or hotter temperatures, you'll get what you see here, which is orange soils. This is an example of a burn that had gotten underneath the root system of a white spruce, burned through it for likely quite some time, probably over a matter of hours or days, and chemically changed that the structure of the soil to bring out iron content to turn that orange. And so that's the orange that we're looking at. It really indicates a very high temperatures and certainly high impacts. You can see evidence of grays elsewhere in this slide. And so that leads us to our soil post-fire index, or soil burn index. And so we have, again, no evidence of recent fire. Depending on how much organic cover is left, will then determine whether you fall into category 1, 2, or 3. If you have no forest floor left, that becomes a 4. And then the degrees within there depend on the coloring of the soil that's within that plot. There are other indicators as well that we use. This is a very recent publication by Terry Jane down here at the bottom. There are other indicators that we use as well, but you can see it's primarily a function of characteristics of the forest floor, humus, and mineral soil. And so these are some examples of that. And so you see on the upper left-hand side, you can see a very light severity, soil severity, where it's just charred the litter. Over here, you've got quite a bit more damage. Now we're looking at about a 3.2, and this is an estimate, my own visual estimate. I have not linked these to the particular plot, so this is my best guess, just doing a visual estimate in creating the presentation here. And then if you look down below at these lower slides, these class 4s, clearly you have no more organic content that's left. And this one on the right-hand side would be an example where you have some orange content to the soils. So let's first take a look at tree versus soil severity. Remember, as I indicated earlier, these things should be correlated, but they're not necessarily the same. You can have a fire that's occurring in the understory that can have a long residence time and create high impacts in that in the understory, but not really affect the overstory to the same extent. And the reverse, you may see, for example, a crown fire that sweeps across an area very rapidly, but because it goes through very rapidly, it doesn't have as long a residence time to the soils. And so we do see evidence of that here. You'll see on the in general, you'll find lower severity burns, soil severity, as indicated by the cooler colors, at your lower tree burn severity index on the left-hand side. And as you make your way over to the right, where you have higher tree severity, you also have higher soil severity. But you can also see we captured a range of severities within that as well. And so it's important to know that make the distinction between what's happening in the overstory and what's happening in the understory, because that can have strong implications for what the future forest may look like. And I should emphasize here, this is a first cut preliminary analysis. We still are analyzing the data, but I wanted to at least show you what the trends look like. And so these are the initial trends. This would be crown severity by forest type. And another goal of our project was to capture a range of fire severities across a range of different forest types. The most common ones here that you see would be, say, deciduous or primarily aspen, deciduous conifer as well. There was a lot of birch in those mixed stands. Jack pine was another very common forest type that was out there, as well as both upland spruce and lowland conifer, primarily lowland spruce. We did capture some other forest types, such as primarily fir or cedar, and some red or white pine stands, but clearly these other types were the ones that were most predominant. The next slide shows soil severity by forest type, and again you see that we have a range of soil severities across the different types, but you can also see that there is some relationship between what happened in the understory and forest and the forest type that was there. Remember, this fire occurred during extreme drought, and so there is still a lot of damage even in the deciduous forests, such as this aspen stand. But they in the deciduous types, tended to have more or lighter severity burns than some other systems that you see in this example. Let me see. I see a question here. Do the different burn severities provide any indication of the type of tree regeneration you would expect to occur? I would say yes. But I'd say the flip side of that, it's a little bit, that wasn't a goal of the project, so it wasn't something that we're measuring. We have photos of it. We have evidence, for example, in areas that were burned by areas that had been heavily burned through jack pine, where we had quite a bit of jack pine regeneration by the following summer. But this is really an initial assessment, and so I don't really have any data to be able to answer a question like that. But yes, I would expect that the different burn severity classes would have consequences for tree regeneration. So moving on to the soil sampling, we measured soils within 3 subplots per plot using standard FIA soil methods. Forest floor was collected within a 30 centimeter diameter circle, and then we collected soil within cores that were at the 0 to 10 centimeter depths and 10 to 20 centimeter depths. Here's a good time to also talk a little bit about the reference plots that we collected that are representative of forest types that had burned within the Pagami Creek area. And so we collected an additional 30 plots that represented a range of different forest types. There we measured soil and forest floor characteristics identical to what we collected in the burn plots, as well as tree species composition, standing woody biomass, and down woody biomass or fuels. I'll talk a little bit about that later on, but these are all data that we collected on reference plots and eventually on the burn plots as well. In addition, there were 5 FIA plots that were what they call their phase 3 or forest health plots, where soils had been collected prior to the burn, and we revisited those. We got permission to go to those sites and resample soils there. So we have before and after information from those 5 individual plots. Just to give you an idea, looking at a reference soil profile, what you're looking at here on the upper right is showing in this case, a fairly shallow humus layer, depending on where you were. This could be very deep to very shallow, and then you can see the A horizon beginning down below, with a fair amount of organics and roots within that. You can see a severely burned soil profile for comparison below. What you see here is actually orange. It burned to the degree that it turned the soil orange at the top here. And then you can see the blackened soil below that layer. And essentially all those fine roots and everything were incinerated during that fire. And then below that you've got essentially the the sublayer of that soil with low organics. This is work that's led by Randy Kolka at the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station in Grand Rapids. Has done the analysis here. We looked at carbon, nitrogen, and carbon and nitrogen ratios for each of the different strata. And really what I'd like to show here is for the forest floor in particular, you see a response where you have declining carbon without much of a response in terms of nitrogen. And so we see a loss of carbon without a corresponding loss of nitrogen, which results in lower carbon and nitrogen ratios. And so the interpretation there is that the burn is removing some carbon, of course, but it's leaving the nitrogen behind, so you get more fertile soils following. The trends in the other soil layers were not as strong, but we certainly saw, in terms of the combined carbon and nitrogen, when you look at carbon-nitrogen ratios, you see the same response even as you go deeper into the soil layer. So this is as a function of the soil burn severity class. We look at the same response according to the tree burn severity class. We see a little bit of a different picture here, where we have kind of a in some cases a decrease, in some cases an increase in carbon on the forest floor, depending on what that tree burn severity class was. But we do see the same consistent response in terms of the carbon-nitrogen ratio as a function of the tree burn severity class. So just to summarize the soil carbon and nitrogen results, again, these are preliminary. We've only analyzed about 100 of the plots. We've got another 30 or so to add to that analysis. But in general, the relationships with soil burn severity is as the soil burn severity increases, carbon is lost through combustion of organic matter, but nitrogen appears to be left behind. That lowers carbon-nitrogen ratios within the burned areas. And again, just for context, if you have a burn that's sufficiently hot, you can volatilize nitrogen, and that does not appear to be the case for this particular fire. When we look at relationships with tree burn severity, again, there was a general trend, although it wasn't significant in terms of carbon and nitrogen decrease. We did see a dip in the least severe class, and an increase in severity, but the carbon-nitrogen ratios indicated a similar response to that observed for soil severity. That is, lower carbon-nitrogen ratios relative in burned areas relative to the reference plots. Now, of course, this analysis doesn't take into account any differences relative to different forest types. We would expect, for example, carbon-nitrogen ratios to be very sensitive to things like conifer content of these different plots. And so the next stage in our analysis would be to incorporate that prior forest type information into the analysis. So why are we interested in mercury? You know, mercury, this is my first experience in researching mercury. And so a lot of this is really new to me. Randy Kolka, who has brought this issue to my attention. But if you look at this slide, shows you why we are interested in mercury. You can see that where we are, Province 212, our ecoregion Province 212, has very high concentrations of mercury deposition. And in particular, in the boundary waters area where you have those very shallow soils, that can translate into high mercury content within the water systems. And just as a quick review of how mercury gets into these forest systems, again, this is one would think a remote wilderness system would have mercury problems, but of course mercury is emitted into the atmosphere from power plants and forestry operations and things like that, and it's emitted into the atmosphere, and that's carried across the world. And it's deposited in rain and snow and as gases and particles into the forested systems. There's evidence to show that conifers can actually scrub more mercury out of the atmosphere than deciduous because they have foliage for a longer period of time. And so what happens over time is that you get bioconcentration of mercury within the forested systems that eventually gets transported through the watersheds and into the water systems, and then gets picked up by the food webs within the water system, and can affect not only the health of the wildlife and fish, but also human health. So that's where the interest lies. And what's not known is what happens when you burn these forests. And so here you have a forest that is a wilderness area that's accumulating mercury. And one would guess that if you burn the forest, perhaps that mercury goes back into the atmosphere and goes elsewhere, or it could be locally distributed. And the honest answer is we really don't know what happens to that mercury. And so here are the initial preliminary results for mercury. What we see, and we don't yet have the analysis done for the reference plots, so you're only looking at the burned plots in this case. But what we do see is that mercury appears to be highest in the most severely burned plots. And for the moment, we don't know why that is. It could be that once you burn the vegetation in that area, you get a lot of local deposition of that mercury that ends up in the soil and forest floor layers. But the honest answer, again, is that we really don't know why we're seeing this response. We need more information, in particular, what the concentration of mercury looks like in the forest types prior to the burn. So real briefly on the remote sensing, and in particular, the hyperspectral. What I have here is a cartoon of hyperspectral imagery from the AVERIS sensor, which is a sensor that NASA puts out. It's an airborne sensor, so it's a flight over a given area. And what makes hyperspectral imagery unique compared to other forms of imagery, such as Landsat, is that Landsat, you may be familiar, has information that you find in different bands. Landsat will have 7 bandwidths that captures a fairly wide range of wavelengths within that band. What makes hyperspectral imagery unique is that it actually has it still has bands. It's not shown here, but it does have bands, but they're essentially continuous. It has 224 of those bands, so that you get a continuous swath of information at different wavelengths. And that signature is what you can use to pull out information about what the image is capturing. It's very, very good at picking up information like chemical content, foliar nitrogen. I've been really impressed with how it's able to separate different tree species, because what it's actually measuring in the leaves is different chemical compounds within the leaves that you can use to separate out different species. So it's very, very sensitive to chemical content and reflectance because of this high resolution. That's what makes it so powerful. And so NASA flew its AVERIS sensor over the site in late October, corresponding with our field visit there. And again, 1 year post-fire in late September 2012. And this just shows you where that image took place. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get full coverage. We got a few swaths that you can see up here that cover the entire northern part of the burn, which corresponded with a large number of our plots, but not all of them. And that just had to do with a very narrow window of time that they had to fly at that time of year. When you have a low sun angle, you need the highest sun angle possible in order to make the flights and they had a very limited time window in order to do this, and so that's one of the reasons why they weren't able to capture the burn. Another reason was you need very clear cloud-free days, and there was a light cloud layer at a certain height or altitude, so they needed to stay below that. So the consequence of that is that we have very high resolution data. I believe it's on the order of 4 meter resolution, but we didn't get full coverage in October. This is just proof of concept and initial analysis to show that yes, indeed, you can separate out the different, at least tree crown or tree burn severity classes based on the imagery. So what you're looking at are different spectral signatures based on whether it was either severely burned, which you see down here in orange and red, or not burned at all, or lightly burned. Again, just proof of concept. We have a lot of analysis yet to do here. Another important information is that, again, just by luck of the draw, because of the remote sensing work that we had been doing in this area, we do have a swath of hyperspectral imagery that occurred before the burn. So we have a lot of very detailed information, again, for this particular swath that you see here in orange that's overlaid with our burn coverage that happened in October of 2011. And then we had one more flight that occurred in late September of 2012 after a full growing season, and that actually covered the entire extent of the burn. So another one of our objectives of this study was not only to look at soils immediately following the fire, but also one growing season following the fire. And so we revisited every single upland site for soil and resampled the soil and forest floor for carbon, nitrogen, and mercury. We also measured tree species composition and standing woody biomass and down woody biomass in terms of fuels according to the design that you see here. So this is the original plot layout that you see in the key down here, and we've overlaid that with the transects that we use to measure coarse weedy debris, as well as prism plots that we use to estimate tree species composition, and small tree plots to get at those smaller trees that are not captured within the prism plots. I'm not going to go really into any detail at all. We have the data entered from this second field effort, but it hasn't yet been analyzed, so that's something for us to work on in the future. And so if you look, take a look at the project timeline, what you'll see here is that the fire started in August of 2012. Let's see here. There we go. And then the rapid expansion occurred in mid-September. We were able to get our first plots established in October and in early November before the snows came. And our average flight was about the same time, late October. Again, we took the winter off. There were some combinations of forest types and severities that we missed in the initial field data collection, and we captured those in as soon as the conditions permitted. For those of you who remember, ice out was very fast in 2012, so we were able to get back into there in late April to establish some remaining plots to fill in the holes in our data that we hadn't captured earlier. Our reference plot data was collected primarily in late May, and then we revisited the plots in August, September for those ancillary measurements, as well as those second measurements of soils that we took as well. And then the second average flight took place in late September, about the time of kind of peak aspen foliage, right about that time period. And so this progression gave us a sense of how important it was. I mean, we made the argument to NSF that we really needed to get in there immediately in order to measure burn severity, because a lot of the indicators were ephemeral. And because we went in there at different times, that actually gave us a much clearer picture of how important that actually is. So I'll give you a sense of that. in the next series of slides. So this is an example from late April where we're estimating burn severities, and you can see that some of the needles have in fact dropped, so they'll be on the ground, but there still is a fair amount of foliage that's left, so you can make some differentiation between scorched material and material that had fallen naturally. So even in late April, there was enough needle retention that we were able to get at the signal. It's not as bright or as distinctive as you might see immediately after the burn. The understory was still bare enough so that we were able to see what's happening in the understory, so we could still make our assessments. But we did have some issues that occurred, following snowmelt, and that may have affected our ability to estimate understory severity. So this would be an example of what the understory looks like in a severe burn in late October. And you can see that there's a lot of this deposition of material that occurred. We're actually looking at wolf prints here. But there's this soft, unstable material that is left over after the burn, and that's what can be sensitive to movement following snowmelt and other precipitation activity. And so we did have examples. This would be an image from late April. This would be on a steeper slope. And so in areas where you had steep slopes or tip-ups or other things, you can have some erosion, so that material had been moved elsewhere, some redistribution of that material to lower positions on the slope. And even as early as late May, we're getting some vegetation growth in there. A lot of the soils had this very greenish tinge to it, which was moss that's already beginning to come back, in particular on top of that mineral soil. You can see some of the leaf wort that's coming back as well. This would be an image from late October again, so this is immediately following the burn. And we saw a lot of evidence of things like this would be the ghost of a log that had burned there. That you see this signature here that burned the soil hot enough to change its color, but the log had burned away, so it's no longer there. And some of those more subtle things weren't as obvious in April. You could still see evidence of changes in color, but it was much more subtle. And this would be an example in late April. You can see a fire that had occurred underneath the bowl of this white pine had certainly changed the color of the soil to be orange, but elsewhere some of the more subtle orange or grays would be more difficult to detect. And so just to recap, in terms of an early spring assessment, we feel that you can do a reasonably accurate assessment of severity as long as you take into account certain phenomena. One of those is the redistribution of unstable soil components. You need to keep that in mind as you're making your assessment. That includes the erosion of mounds and slopes. You can expect some loss of soil color indicators. Certainly there's leaf and needle drop that occurs over the winter season, and so it may become more difficult to detect what was naturally dropped versus scorched information. The scorched foliage is less striking, which is important particularly for the remote sensing information. And stem char patterns became a little bit less distinct. But in general, the important thing was the indicators were still present, they were visible, and what was important is that you got in there before the understory growth began. That becomes much more obvious when you look at our August examples, and so this would be a comparison of an image that occurred in October of 2011 versus August of 2012 at the same location. We had a lot of vegetation regrowth when we went back there, and so collecting soil information was simple enough. But to do an understory burn severity assessment would be very difficult at this time. And you can also see the difference in terms of foliage retention up on the as of October versus what foliage still, scorched material still remains. And so, again, I think the argument was well made to NSF that it's important to get in there right after the burn to capture those ephemeral characteristics. One more example here of the extent of moss coverage that can grow in. We had a very wet May and June in this area, so a lot of vegetation growth. Anything that had exposure to the sun and was exposed mineral soil was generally covered by moss and liverwort. So some things that are forthcoming, we expect to contrast soil carbon, nitrogen, and mercury immediately versus 1 year post-burn. We'll be analyzing the response variables using forest composition as covariates. We'll be estimating fuel loading and woody carbon stocks from our information, and then the final stage will be scaling up our results using the remote sensing information. So please stay tuned. As you can see to the bottom here, you can see a website with our project information, and we hope to update that information soon. In terms of future research directions, we have strong interest in the consequences of those burn severity patterns on the patterns of vegetation recovery, given that we have very solid information on what the pre-fire vegetation composition and spatial pattern was. So looking at how those are influenced by, say, weather behavior, landscape physiography, and pre-fire conditions, how those things conspire to affect burn severity patterns, which then affect patterns of vegetation recovery, as well as what happens to carbon, nitrogen, and mercury through time. Another area of interest is placing the Pagami Creek Fire, which you see here in the lower left, in the context of the other burns that have occurred recently in this area, for which a fair amount of research has already been conducted. And so these burns are very large wildfires that took place during very different conditions, will make for very interesting contrasts. We'd like to thank certainly the National Science Foundation's Ecosystems Program for funding this research, as well as the NASA Carbon Cycle and Ecosystems Program. They were the ones that donated the average time for this project. The U.S. Forest Service National Fire Plan is the plan that funds my salary and keeps me working. So a huge shout out to them, as well as the Superior National Forest. Again, we could not have done this work without their cooperation. They really were outstanding in getting us in there rapidly and in a safe way. I can't say enough about them. In particular, the names that are listed there, as well as some other cooperators that helped throughout the extent of the short extent of the study. We had a very dedicated field team. This is just a partial image of the field crew members that are there, along with some of the PIs in this image. A lot of those people are not shown, but we really thank the people that contributed to this project. And so with that, I guess I'd like to field any questions you may have.
Well, certainly, Brian, thank you very much. And as Brian mentioned, we'll stay on here a bit. I have a couple of questions myself, but please take a few moments, those that are still on, to ask questions if you have them. We will make this presentation available. It will be accessible online at the same place that you went to on our website to find it initially. While I wait for some questions to come in, very early on in the presentation you were showing some imagery, some high quality imagery, and I was wondering that allowed you to characterize the canopy. I was wondering if you'd made any attempt to compare that information to the landfire data that's been produced nationally.
You know, we have not yet, but certainly the information that we're providing at this scale will be far more detailed than what Landfire will be able to produce for two reasons. You know, it's not necessarily that Landfire is not producing useful information, but it's a national product. And by definition, when you apply something nationally at that scale, locally it will have a much lower resolution in terms of what's actually there versus something that's restricted to a particular study area. So the information that we're providing just for that reason alone should be more precise. But then the Landfire is based primarily on Landsat information. That's only one of the sensors that we've used to characterize the information in this study area. So when you add that to the spot imagery that we have, which is at 10 and 5 meter resolution, you have higher resolution information that allows you to get at things like tree canopy architecture that you wouldn't be able to get at with 30 meter resolution Landsat. Those are just a couple examples of the kinds of, those would be some of the reasons why what we have is much more detailed information than what you would find at a national scale. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks. So I see Charles has asked a question. What surprised you most after revisiting the sampling sites last summer?
Well, I had seen some images of regeneration following the Ham Lake fire in comparison with the Cavity Lake fire, and noticed that the Cavity Lake fire really had very low regeneration in comparison to the Ham Lake. So Ham Lake had, it was a spring fire, would have been late May into June when that occurred, and so the understory was not nearly as affected as it was during the Cavity Lake fire. But the Cavity Lake fire occurred in the summer, kind of similar weather conditions to the Pagami, but it also occurred within the blowdown, which had a much higher, clearly higher fuel loading, and so the impacts to the understory were clearly higher. And so when we got into the Pagami, I figured that we would have some opportunity to do some additional assessments in the understory. It was impossible. I mean, the amount of vegetation growth that occurred was pretty astounding. I think that had something to do with the timing of the burn, as well as the conditions also following the fire. We had a very wet spring that might have contributed, but clearly the amount of vegetation growth had surprised me.
Okay, well, like I said, I have a few questions or comments of my own, and so I'll continue to seed the discussion here for a few moments anyway.
Okay.
You sound like you do have some pretty specific recommendations about the timing of any sort of monitoring effort. Certainly your project is more research-oriented, so you're taking detailed measurements and such. But do you think that based on what you're seeing so far and perhaps into the future, you'll be able to suggest some sequencing of monitoring in terms of when they should visit these sites, if in fact field crews that are conducting prescribed burns, some guidelines that they should apply in forest settings to monitor their fires?
Well, that information is as I understand it, and again, it's the area is a bit new to me. So if I get some of the details incorrect, what I'll tell you is from my own experience, what I've seen so far. But it seems to me that the monitoring folks get in there quite rapidly. They know that it's important to get in there very soon after a burn. I would say one of the things that I notice is, in particular in the low severity areas, if you're making estimates of fuel loadings, going in there 1 year post as a follow-up, I think is quite valuable, because a lot of the material that might have been standing, if you actually get in there right after the burn, would in fact come down, particularly in areas that have these shallow soils. And so that was something that was really striking in terms of fuel estimates or fuel loadings that occurred after the burn. You could actually get in there too soon. But in terms of some of the others, I think it's pretty clear that if you want the best assessment of what happened, what the severity really was, getting in there within a month or so is very important.
Do you anticipate going back and actually doing some of the regeneration samples in these areas to see if you can relate them to the burn severities you observed?
We hope to. We have now proposals in the works to do that very thing, and so again, with a strong coupling between plot level studies and coupling that with the remote sensing, because I think between the two is what makes this study really unique.
Well, I do see there are a couple folks typing. I don't know if they're actually, so here's one of them that has come in. Mike Crook asks, will you be making any burn severity comparisons with the Hammond cavity as a result of this study?
We hope to. We're, Lee Freelick is a collaborator on the project and made his data available to our group. Sean Fravor had worked on the Ham Lake fire as well. So just within our team, we have connections that we can use to make those comparisons. And there's a lot of data also collected by the National Forest as well. I think there's real strong opportunity for synthesis, which I think is very important to do. So yeah, I would be very excited to do that kind of work.
Another question that came in, the roving crew asks, was there any discussion on the selection criteria for the reference plots? In other words, location, disturbance.
There was. What we ended up using was we used the detailed forest type maps or forest composition and prior disturbance that we had from the earlier remote sensing, and use that to stratify out what was in the burn, and from that determine what kinds of conditions we needed to measure outside of the burn. So we kind of used a stratified approach to using what was there from the remote sensing to tell us what to sample outside the burn.
Well, we're about an hour and 15 minutes into this. I don't know if there are any other questions coming. I can leave the webinar interface open for a few minutes and certainly encourage anyone that lingers after we close the presentation to consider typing in those questions. I will be capturing those. I certainly will stay in contact with Brian. And I see one is coming in right now. And as I wait for that, I'm going to certainly make a few closing comments here. The Fond du Lac folks say thanks. I think we all agree on that. But I do want to mention that our next webinar, the Lake States Fire Science Consortium during the fall, winter, and early spring sponsors monthly webinars. We do plan to have Jessica Meisel talk about her research looking into what we know and don't know about fire science in the Lake States. She did a comprehensive study of research materials specific to the Lake States, and she'll be talking about those kinds of findings on our third Thursday webinar in March, like this one at 2 o'clock Eastern, 1 o'clock Central. Again, we do encourage you to visit our website at lakestatesfiresci.net. There you can see some of the things we're building, access some of the resources that we're putting together, and you can sign up for our newsletters and future mailings. We do appreciate the attendance that we've been getting this year. We certainly appreciate your participation in asking questions, and you certainly can contact me directly, and I'll make sure that Brian gets any of those contacts. I did capture a couple of the publications that Brian mentioned, and we'll be adding those references to the website that references his presentation, where it also will have the link to rewatch the webinar that we've had today. So if there are no further questions, I will go ahead and make my final thanks to Brian and to all of you who have joined with us, and we certainly look forward to you joining us next month. Anything last comments, Brian, before we call it close.
I just wanted to say thanks to you and to the group for listening in, and to stay tuned for more work.
All right.